Garrett spilled his whiskey when the knocking started. 3 sharp, desperate raps at midnight. You didn't come to a Hells Angels compound for charity. You came because you were fresh out of options or completely out of your mind. Pulling the deadbolt back, he didn't find a rival crew looking for trouble. He found a soaking wet 15-year-old boy clutching a shivering little girl, begging the most dangerous men in town to hide his sister for just one night. Garrett sat alone at the heavy oak bar, a rag in one hand and a half-empty glass of rye in the other. The clubhouse smelled the way it always did at 3 in the morning, a sour, permanent rot of spilled draft beer baked into the floorboards, layered beneath the sharp chemical bite of gun oil, cheap pine cleaner, and stale Marlboro smoke. He was 42. His knees ached from a highway wipeout a decade gone, and the heavy leather cut resting on the stool beside him felt more like a straitjacket tonight than a badge of honor. The security monitor in the corner of the room flickered. It was a cheap, grainy black and white feed that made the alleyway outside look like a submerged submarine. Garrett didn't look up at first. The wind was whipping off the interstate, rattling the chain-link fence, tossing garbage bins around. He took another swallow of the rye. It burned on the way down, settling like a hot coal in his chest. Then came the knock. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic pounding of a cop executing a warrant, nor was it the confident, synchronized banging of a rival charter coming to make a point. It was frantic, uneven. 3 sharp, pathetic slaps against the reinforced steel, followed by a pause, and then 2 more. Garrett set his glass down. The ice clinked softly against the rim. He stood up, the floorboards groaning under his steel-toed boots, and walked over to the monitor. The fisheye lens distorted the figures, but he could make out 2 shapes huddled under the awning. One was tall, skinny, shifting its weight from side to side. The other was small. Tiny, really. Garrett sighed, rubbing a calloused hand over his bearded jaw. His knuckles popped. He didn't reach for the Smith & Wesson holstered under the bar, but he didn't walk to the door empty-handed either. He grabbed a heavy iron tire iron resting by the coat rack, sliding it seamlessly up his sleeve so it pressed cold against his forearm. He unlatched the first deadbolt. The heavy metallic clack echoed in the cavernous room. Then the second. He turned the handle and pulled the heavy door inward just 4 inches, keeping his shoulder pressed firmly against the frame. The cold rushed in immediately, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and ozone. Standing on the concrete step was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 15. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead in wet, greasy strips. He wore a thin, faded denim jacket that was doing absolutely nothing against the November rain. His teeth were chattering so violently Garrett could hear them over the storm. But it was what the boy was holding that made Garrett's eyes narrow. Tucked into the boy's side, gripping his waist with white-knuckled intensity, was a little girl. 7, maybe 8 years old. She wore a soaking wet yellow raincoat that was entirely too large for her, the hem dragging on the concrete. She didn't have shoes on, just pink socks, soaked straight through, stained brown with mud. "We're closed," Garrett said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, devoid of any warmth. He started to push the door shut. The boy thrust his arm out, jamming a cheap, waterlogged canvas sneaker into the doorframe. The steel pinched his ankle, but he didn't flinch. "Wait, please." The kid's voice cracked. He was terrified. His eyes kept darting past Garrett, looking into the dark cavern of the clubhouse, staring at the massive winged skull painted on the far wall. Are you the Angels?" "Take your foot out of my door, kid," Garrett said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. "They said you hate 'em," the boy blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in a panicked rush. "The guys down at the garage, they said Wade owes you money. They said you hate him." Garrett stopped applying pressure to the door. Wade. Wade was a low-level crank dealer who operated out of a trailer park on the east side of town. He was a loudmouth, a sloppy drunk, and yes, he owed the club $3,000. He was also a liability. "Wade's your old man?" Garrett asked. "Stepdad," the boy corrected, shivering violently. He pulled the little girl closer. He's coming. He found out I took the money from his mattress. We were trying to get to the Greyhound station, but he caught us on the avenue. I hit him with a brick. We ran. But he's got his truck. He's looking for us. Garrett stared at the kid. The sheer stupidity of it all was staggering. A 15-year-old steals from a meth dealer, hits him with a brick, and then comes to the Hells Angels for sanctuary. It was a joke. It had to be. Go to the cops, Garrett said, his face a mask of absolute indifference. He pays the cops, the kid screamed, a sudden raw burst of desperation that echoed in the alleyway. Deputy Miller is his cousin. If they find us, they take us back. If we go back... The kid swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. He looked down at the little girl. He said he's going to put Lily in the basement again, please. Just for tonight. Just let her sit inside. I'll stay out here in the rain, just her. Garrett looked at the girl. She hadn't said a word. She wasn't crying. Her face was pale. Her lips possessed a faint bluish tint from the cold, but her eyes were locked onto Garrett's. They were completely empty. There was no fear in them, no hope, just a profound, devastating exhaustion that no 8-year-old should ever possess. Garrett felt a sudden, sharp twist in his gut. It wasn't pity. Pity was useless. It was a dark, ugly recognition. He had seen that exact same look in the mirror 30 years ago, right before he burned his own house to the ground. He looked down the alley. The street lamps cast long, sickly yellow pools on the wet pavement. Nothing but rain. Move your foot, Garrett said. The boy hesitated, panic flashing in his eyes, but he pulled his soaked sneaker back. Garrett swung the heavy steel door open, stepping back into the shadows. Get in, both of you, before I change my mind. The heavy steel door slammed shut, slicing off the sound of the storm like a guillotine. Garrett threw the deadbolts, the metallic echoes bouncing harshly off the cinderblock walls of the vestibule. Tripp and Lily stood dripping on the heavy rubber welcome mat bearing the club's insignia. Puddles of dirty rainwater immediately began to pool around their feet, seeping into the cold concrete. Under the harsh fluorescent overhead light of the entryway, their condition was stark. Tripp sported a swelling purple cheekbone and a fresh leaking cut on his jaw. Lily simply stood there, a small, shivering yellow ghost. Garrett didn't speak. He walked past them, his boots thudding heavily, and grabbed a stack of clean shop towels from a metal shelf. He tossed them. Tripp fumbled but managed to catch 2. Dry off, Garrett ordered, turning his back. He walked to the bar, retrieved his glass of rye, and downed the rest of it in one burning swallow. He was angry at himself. Letting them in was a severe tactical error. The clubhouse was a fortress, but it was primarily a place of business. Secured behind a heavy steel cage in the back office were ledgers the ATF would kill to acquire, alongside enough illicit product to send half the charter to federal prison. You did not invite unpredictable elements into the house. It was an ironclad rule. Garrett, the voice rumbled from the dark hallway leading to the bunk rooms. Deep, gritty with sleep. William Vandenberg, known to everyone breathing as Dutch, stepped into the dim light. 6'4" of scarred muscle and faded ink, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms wore only gray sweatpants. He was a man who viewed the entire world strictly through the lens of threat assessment. Dutch stopped, his eyes locking onto the 2 dripping children near the pool tables. He slowly turned his massive head. Tell me, Dutch said, dangerously calm, that you're running a charity drive I don't know about. Kid knocked, Garrett said, leaning against the bar. He picked up a rag and wiped the pristine wood, avoiding Dutch's gaze. Said Wade's looking for him. Dutch slowly walked over, the floorboards creaking in protest. He tapped a cigarette from a pack on the counter and lit it with a battered Zippo. The sharp smell of sulfur and burning tobacco filled the space. He took a long drag, staring at Tripp through the blue smoke. Wade, Dutch repeated. The tweak who owes us? And why is his problem currently dripping on my pool room floor? Tripp swallowed hard, stepping in front of Lily to shield her with his thin frame. A futile gesture against a giant like Dutch, but Garrett noted it. I took his money. Tripp's voice wobbled pathetically. He beat up our mom. He locked Lily in the basement. I took the money so we could leave, but he chased us. Dutch didn't blink. His expression remained entirely unreadable. He took another drag, the cherry glowing bright orange. You stole from a dealer, you hit him, and then you brought his heat to our front door. I didn't know where else to go, Tripp pleaded, hands shaking around the dirty towel. The cops work for him. Please, just a place to hide for a few hours. At sunrise, we walk to the county line. Dutch turned to Garrett, not bothering to lower his voice. Put them back outside, Rust. Right now. Garrett stopped wiping the bar, feeling the heavy weight of club discipline pressing down. Dutch was right. The equation was clean. Massive risk, zero reward. It's pouring out there, Dutch, Garrett said softly. I don't give a shit if it's raining fire, Dutch snapped, leaning over the bar, his voice dropping to a lethal hum. We got a shipment coming tomorrow. We got feds sniffing the docks. If Wade calls his cop cousin, they don't just find runaways. They find the lockbox. You want to throw away the whole charter for a street rat? Wade won't call the cops. Garrett met Dutch's eyes. He's terrified of us. People do stupid things angry. Put them out. Garrett looked past Dutch. Tripp was trembling, eyes wide with impending doom. But Lily had moved. She stood by a heavy leather armchair, her small, dirty fingers tracing the embossed winged skull on the upholstery. She looked up, her empty, dark eyes meeting Garrett's. She wasn't looking at him as a savior. She was looking at him like just another monster in a world entirely populated by them. Garrett's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked in his cheek. He tossed the rag down. They stay until dawn, Garrett said. Dutch froze, his cigarette suspended. Excuse me? I said they stay until dawn, Garrett repeated, his voice hitting that quiet, dangerous register that ended all debate. As president, his word was final law. Wade owes us $3,000. If he wants to come to my door looking for his punching bags, he pays the toll first. Until then, the kids stay. The tension thickened, dense and suffocating. For a second, Garrett thought his sergeant-at-arms might actually swing on him. Instead, Dutch crushed his cigarette violently into a glass ashtray and shook his head in disgust. You're a fool, Rust, letting a ghost from your past burn down your present. He turned toward the hallway. If the cops kick the door in, I'm shooting you first. The shadows swallowed him, leaving Garrett alone with the children and the drumming rain. Letting out a slow breath, Garrett walked out from behind the bar. Tripp flinched. Follow me, Garrett grunted. And don't touch anything. Garrett marched them past the heavy oak bar, down a corridor stinking of stale sweat, stale beer, and the sharp chemical bite of bleach. They entered the prospect's bunk room. It was a sterile, windowless concrete box, illuminated by a single buzzing, exposed bulb swinging gently from the ceiling. The floor radiated a damp chill that seeped immediately through the soles of Garrett's heavy boots. Sit, Garrett commanded, blocking the only exit with his massive frame. His leather cut creaked as he crossed his arms. Tripp practically collapsed onto the thin, unmade mattress, his legs finally giving out. He pulled Lily up beside him. She tucked her mud-stained pink socks beneath her oversized yellow raincoat, pulling her knees tightly to her chest. In the harsh light, she looked like a brilliant piece of fragile debris washed up in a concrete bunker. Take the coat off her, Garrett said. She's freezing in her own sweat. Tripp's numb fingers fumbled with the stiff plastic snaps. When the slick yellow material finally peeled away, Garrett had to physically bite the inside of his cheek to keep his expression entirely blank. Beneath the coat, the girl wore a faded, threadbare t-shirt. Her collarbone looked sharp enough to cut paper, but her left arm commanded his immediate attention. It was wrapped in a crude, filthy bandage of torn bed sheets. Dark, dried blood had seeped through the fabric, crusting in the shape of a jagged star. A cold, terribly familiar anger coiled in Garrett's stomach. It was an old, tired rage. He had spent his entire adult life swimming in violence. He had shattered jaws with pool cues and put men in intensive care, ensuring his own soul was thoroughly, permanently blackened. But his violence had rules. It possessed a twisted, pragmatic gravity. This was different. This was pure cowardice masquerading as authority. Without a single word, Garrett turned his back and walked to the bar. He retrieved a dented metal first aid kit, heavily stocked with trauma pads, 2 bottles of water, and a cellophane-wrapped package of stale pretzels from the kitchenette. When he returned to the bunk room, Tripp was whispering frantically to Lily, his hands waving in distress. He stopped instantly when Garrett's shadow fell across the floor. Garrett tossed the food and water onto the cot. Eat. Tripp ripped the plastic packaging with his teeth and shoved a pretzel toward his sister. She ignored it, her hollow dark eyes fixed entirely on Garrett. Dragging a metal folding chair across the concrete, the legs scraping harshly, Garrett sat opposite them. He popped the metal latches on the medical box. "Give me the arm." Tripp immediately stiffened, inching forward. "I can do it. I cleaned it." Garrett shifted his flat, dead gaze to the boy. "You wrapped it in a dirty rag, kid. By tomorrow morning, it's going to fester. She's going to get a blood infection, and she'll be dead by Tuesday. Give me the arm." Lily didn't wait for her brother's permission. She slowly extended her frail, trembling arm toward the giant biker. Garrett took her thin wrist gently. His hands were massive, heavily calloused, and deeply stained with engine grease that never fully washed off, yet his movements were meticulously precise. He unknotted the filthy cloth and peeled it back. It was a burn, the undeniable blistering shape of a hot clothing iron pressed deliberately against her bicep. The edges were angry and raised, the center weeping a clear, yellowish fluid. Garrett's jaw tightened until his molars ground together. He didn't speak. He reached into the kit, retrieved a bottle of saline, and flushed the wound. The girl flinched, a sharp hiss of breath escaping her clenched teeth, but no tears fell. "Who did this?" Garrett asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Wade," Tripp whispered, staring at the floorboards. "He said she was being too loud. She dropped a glass." Garrett nodded slowly. He applied a thick, soothing layer of burn ointment, covered the raw flesh with a sterile gauze pad, and wrapped it tightly with pristine white tape. He released her wrist. "Keep it dry," Garrett muttered. He stood up, folding the chair with a loud clank. "Mister?" The voice was so quiet he almost missed it. Lily's tone was thin and raspy, sounding like dry leaves scraping across wet pavement. "Yeah, kid." "Are you going to kill him?" she asked. She didn't ask with fear, nor with malice. She asked it the way a child inquires if it's going to rain tomorrow. It was a simple, practical question regarding the weather of her brutal world. Garrett stared at her. For a fraction of a second, the heavy iron armor of his cynicism cracked wide open. He saw the void inside this little girl, a dark emptiness carved out by a man who used power to crush the weak. Garrett knew he wasn't a good man. He lived miles outside the law and sold poison. But in this terrible, crystal-clear moment, he knew exactly what his purpose was. He was the monster that other monsters feared. "I don't know, kid," Garrett said quietly. "Depends on how polite he is." He stepped out, pulling the door shut until the heavy latch clicked into place. Returning to the main clubhouse, the sprawling space felt overwhelmingly hollow. He bypassed the whiskey, poured a mug of battery-acid black coffee, and sat on a stool facing the front door. He left the overhead lights off. The neon beer signs hummed violently in the windows, casting long, bloody streaks of red and blue across the scarred floorboards. Reaching beneath the counter, his fingers brushed past his holstered pistol and curled firmly around the worn wood of a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun. He pulled it out, checking the breech. Click-clack. 2 heavy brass shells gleamed dull in the neon light. He snapped it shut and laid it on the bar beside his steaming coffee. 20 minutes passed. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the metal roof was a hypnotic, isolating sound. Then, the pattern broke. A low, mechanical growl cut through the storm. Headlights swept violently across the frosted glass, flooding the dim room with harsh halogen light. The obnoxious roar of a poorly tuned V8 engine revved once, screaming in the quiet night. then abruptly died. Heavy boots crunched on wet gravel. Metallic thuds echoed as car doors slammed shut. Footsteps approached the front door, confident, aggressive, stupid. Someone hammered a heavy fist against the reinforced steel. Garrett picked up the shotgun. He stood, his boots totally silent on the floorboards, and walked slowly toward the entrance. "Hey, I know you're in there," a slurred, panicked voice shouted through the steel. "Open the damn door, Rust! They're my property!" Garrett stopped 2 feet from the threshold. He didn't reach for the deadbolt. He didn't speak. He just stood in the dark, the 12-gauge resting casually against his hip, waiting for the man on the other side to make a fatal mistake. Bang! 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 "Don't make me get the crowbar, Rust!" Wade yelled, his voice cracking on the last syllable. Garrett didn't flinch. He reached out with his left hand and flipped the heavy iron latch on the viewing port. The metal slide grated harshly, exposing a narrow barred rectangle of the storm outside. Wade's face was pressed almost directly against the steel grid. He looked exactly how Garrett expected. His skin was a sallow, sickly gray beneath the harsh outdoor security light. Rain plastered his thinning, pale hair to his skull. His pupils were blown wide, black and massive, twitching with the erratic, humming energy of a 3-day amphetamine bender. He smelled like wet dog, exhaust fumes, and cheap beer. Behind him, idling in the muddy gravel lot, was a rusted 1998 Ford F-150. 2 other men stood by the tailgate. They wore oversized hoodies, their hands jammed into their pockets, shoulders hunched against the freezing rain. They weren't looking at the door. They were looking at the row of Harleys parked under the awning, their eyes darting around like nervous rats. "Open the damn door," Wade sneered, his breath fogging the cold metal. He slapped the door with his palm. "I want my kids." "You don't have kids, Wade," Garrett said. His voice was a low, steady drone that cut through the noise of the storm. "You have a debt, $3,000. It was due last month." Wade blinked, his meth-addled brain struggling to switch gears. He wiped a hand across his wet mouth. "This ain't about the money. That little bastard stole from me. He took a brick to my head." Wade turned his head slightly, trying to show Garrett a messy, bleeding gash behind his right ear. "I'm bleeding, man. I'm taking them home. Now open up." $3,000, Garrett repeated, his expression entirely dead. "Plus a late fee. Let's call it $4,000. You slide $4,000 under the crack in this door, and we can talk about who's inside my clubhouse." "Are you deaf?" Wade's voice spiked an octave, panic and rage colliding in his throat. He grabbed the iron bars of the viewing port and shook them. They didn't budge a millimeter. "I ain't paying you shit. I want the boy and I want the girl. If you don't give them to me right now, I'm calling Deputy Miller. He's sitting in his cruiser right down on Route 9. He'll be here in 3 minutes and he'll tear this whole place apart." Garrett stared at Wade's white-knuckled fingers gripping the bars. He knew Miller. The deputy was a spineless badge wearer who took envelopes of cash from the Angels to look the other way when the trucks rolled in late at night. Miller was also Wade's cousin. It was a messy, localized web of small-town corruption. If Miller showed up, he wouldn't kick the door down. He was too cowardly for that. But he would sit in the driveway with his lights flashing. He would run the plates on the bikes. He would make a scene. And a scene was exactly what the club couldn't afford with a shipment sitting in the back room. Garrett knew exactly what Dutch would do in this moment. Dutch would drag the kids out by their hair, hand them to Wade, and then beat Wade half to death for knocking on the door in the first place. It was the smart play, the clean play. Garrett looked down at his own hand. His knuckles were white against the worn wood of the shotgun stock. He thought about the blistering, weeping burn on a little girl's arm. He made the dumb play. Garrett didn't say a word. He stepped back from the viewing port, unlatched the top deadbolt, then the bottom. Wade let out a sharp, triumphant bark of laughter outside. "Yeah, that's what I thought, you old washed-up." Garrett grabbed the door handle, planted his heavy steel-toed boot against the center of the door, and shoved with all his weight. The heavy steel door exploded outward. It caught Wade squarely in the center of his face with a sickening, wet crunch. Wade screamed, stumbling backward into the mud, his hands flying to his nose. Blood immediately gushed between his fingers, mixing with the rain, washing down his chin and staining the collar of his cheap windbreaker. Before Wade could find his balance, Garrett stepped over the threshold into the freezing downpour. He moved with a sudden, violent speed that betrayed his age and his bad knees. He grabbed Wade by the throat with his left hand, lifting the smaller man onto his toes, and slammed him back against the corrugated metal siding of the clubhouse. The two goons by the truck jumped, their hands flying out of their pockets. One of them pulled a short, rusted tire iron. Garrett didn't even look at them. He just brought his right hand up, leveling the sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun directly at the chest of the man with the iron. The pump-action clack of Garrett racking a shell into the chamber sounded like a cannon shot in the alleyway. The two goons froze. The man with the tire iron dropped it. It clattered against the wet gravel. They both took 3 very slow, very deliberate steps backward, melting into the shadows of the truck. Garrett turned his attention back to Wade. He pressed the twin barrels of the shotgun hard beneath Wade's jaw, forcing the man's bleeding head up into the rain. Wade's eyes were wide, rolling with stark, absolute terror. He was choking on his own blood, his feet pedaling uselessly against the siding. "Listen to me very closely, because I'm only going to say this once," Garrett whispered. The rain ran down his face, matting his beard, but his voice was terrifyingly calm. "If you ever knock on my door again, I will not open it. I will just shoot right through the wood. And if I ever see you within a mile of this compound, I will take you out to the quarry, chain you to an engine block, and throw you in." Wade whimpered, a pathetic wet sound in the back of his throat. He tried to nod, but the shotgun barrels dug deeper into his flesh. "Get in your truck," Garrett said, releasing Wade's throat. Wade collapsed into the mud, landing on his hands and knees. He didn't try to stand. He scrambled backward like a crab, scrambling through the puddles until he reached the open passenger door of the F-150. He hauled himself inside, slamming the door shut. The driver didn't wait. The truck's engine screamed, the rear tires spinning wildly in the gravel, kicking up a massive spray of mud before catching traction. The Ford fishtailed out of the lot, blew straight through a stop sign, and disappeared into the rainy dark. Garrett stood in the downpour for a long time, watching the red taillights fade. His chest heaved. The cold was sinking into his bones, settling deep in his bad joints. The adrenaline began to drain, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. He had just started a war over $3,000 and a runaway. Dutch was going to kill him. He lowered the shotgun, turned around, and walked back inside, pulling the heavy steel door shut against the storm. The locking of the deadbolts felt terribly final. Garrett stood in the vestibule, water pooling around his boots, staring at the scarred metal of the door. He didn't feel righteous. He didn't feel like a protector. He felt like a man who had just lit a fuse in a very small, very crowded room. He wiped his wet face with his sleeve, the coarse denim scratching his skin, and walked slowly back into the clubhouse. The neon signs cast long, distorted shadows across the pool tables. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. He walked past the bar, ignoring the half-empty bottle of rye calling his name, and headed down the dark corridor toward the prospect's bunk room. He didn't open the door right away. He stood outside, listening. No crying. No talking. Just the faint rhythmic sound of breathing. Garrett pushed the door open an inch. It squeaked slightly on its hinges. Instantly, a shadow moved in the dark. Garrett pushed the door wider. Tripp was standing in the center of the cramped room. The boy held the heavy metal folding chair raised above his head, his arms trembling violently under the weight, his eyes wide and feral in the dim light spilling from the hallway. He looked ready to smash the skull of whoever walked through that frame. Garrett stopped in the doorway. He didn't raise his shotgun. He just looked at the boy. "Put the chair down, kid," Garrett said softly. Tripp blinked, chest heaving as he gasped for air. He lowered the chair slowly, the metal legs clanging harshly against the concrete floor. He looked at Garrett's wet clothes, the water dripping from his beard, and the weapon hanging loosely at his side. "Was it him?" Tripp asked. His voice was a ragged whisper. "Yeah," Garrett said. He leaned the shotgun against the doorframe and stepped into the room. He looked over at the cot. Lily was asleep. She was curled into a tight, impossible little ball, her knees tucked beneath her chin. She was clutching the empty, crumpled cellophane pretzel wrapper in her good hand, holding on to it like it was a security blanket. Her breathing was shallow but steady. "Is he coming back?" Tripp asked, taking a step closer to the cot, placing himself between Garrett and his sister. It was instinctual. "Not tonight," Garrett said. He walked over to the second cot and sat down on the edge. The springs groaned in protest. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the concrete floor. "He's gone." Tripp didn't relax. The tension in his thin shoulders remained tight as a coiled spring. He looked around the windowless concrete room. "What happens in the morning?" It was the question Garrett had been avoiding. He rubbed his eyes with his thumbs, feeling the grit and exhaustion settling into his skin. "In the morning, the sun comes up," Garrett said, looking up at the boy. He decided to give him the truth. No sugarcoating, no bullshit. "And then I have to figure out what to do with you. This isn't an orphanage, kid. You can't stay here. My men, they aren't social workers. They're not going to tolerate you being underfoot." Tripp swallowed hard. He looked down at his ruined, mud-stained sneakers. "I know. I'm sorry. We just needed a minute to stop running." The raw honesty in the kid's voice hit Garrett harder than Wade's tire iron ever could have. It was the terrible realization that this 15-year-old boy had already accepted that the world had no place for him. He wasn't asking for a home. He was just asking for a pause. "Well, why did you do it?" Tripp asked suddenly, looking back up. His dark eyes searched Garrett's face, looking for a catch, a hidden motive. "You don't know us. That guy out there, the big guy, he wanted to throw us out to Wade. Why did you stop him?" Garrett looked at the boy for a long time. He could have told him about the burn on Lily's arm. He could have told him about the ghosts in his own past, about the father who used belts and extension cords, about the night Garrett struck a match and walked away from a burning house. He could have tried to bridge the gap between them, to show the kid they shared a common ugly lineage. But he didn't. Some scabs weren't meant to be picked at in front of an audience. "He owed me money," Garrett lied smoothly, his face an unreadable mask. "I don't let people who owe me money tell me what to do on my own porch." Tripp stared at him. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he was too tired to push it. He nodded slowly, backing up until his legs hit the edge of his sister's cot. He sat down carefully, making sure not to jostle her. "Get some sleep, kid," Garrett grunted, standing up. His knees popped loudly in the quiet room. "You got a few hours before the world wakes up." Garrett picked up his shotgun, walked out of the bunk room, and pulled the door shut behind him. He didn't go back to the bar. He didn't go to his own room. He pulled one of the heavy leather armchairs from the main room, dragged it down the hallway, and positioned it right outside the kid's door. He sat down, resting the 12-gauge across his lap. He stared down the long, dark corridor toward the front of the clubhouse. The rain continued to beat against the roof, a relentless drumming rhythm. Garrett closed his eyes, listening to the storm, waiting for the inevitable dawn. Dawn did not arrive with a gentle, rosy glow. It bled through the frosted, barred windows of the clubhouse in a harsh, unforgiving gray. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised knee and a sprawling gravel lot composed entirely of deep, oily puddles. Garrett woke up with a sharp crick in his neck. He was still sitting in the leather armchair outside the bunk room, the heavy shotgun resting heavy across his thighs. His mouth tasted like pennies and old coffee. He blinked, the grit in his eyes scraping like sandpaper, and listened. The clubhouse was beginning to stir. Somewhere in the back, the massive industrial pipes groaned as someone turned on the hot water. The heavy thud of boots sounded on the floorboards above. Garrett cracked his neck, a sickening series of pops echoing in the empty hall. He stood up, hiding the shotgun back under the bar, just as the heavy metal door to the kitchen swung open. A prospect named Jax walked out, carrying a colossal aluminum tray of scrambled eggs that smelled heavily of cheap butter and black pepper. Jax was 22, entirely too eager, and possessed a neck tattoo that looked like it had been done in a moving vehicle. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Garrett. Then Jax looked past the president, staring down the hallway. Tripp had opened the bunk room door. The 15-year-old was standing in the threshold, looking like a trapped animal. He had his hands up, resting against the door frame, mapping out exits that didn't exist. Behind his leg, half hidden in the shadows, was Lily. Jax blinked, his jaw dropping slightly. He looked at Garrett, then back at the kids. Boss? We running a daycare today? Shut your mouth, Jax, and put the eggs on the warmer, Garrett grunted, rubbing his face. The kitchen door swung open again, and this time it was Dutch. He was fully dressed now, wearing a faded black t-shirt and his heavy leather cut. The sergeant-at-arms took one look at the scene, the prospect holding the eggs, the two bruised children in the hallway, and Garrett standing between them, and let out a slow, rumbling sigh. I see the strays survived the night, Dutch said. His voice was flat, devoid of the burning anger from the night before, replaced instead by a cold, clinical calculation. He walked over to the coffee pot, pouring himself a mug. He didn't look at the kids. He looked at Garrett. Sun's up, Rust. Time to pay the piper. You said dawn. I know what I said, Garrett replied. He walked past Dutch, snatching 2 paper plates from a stack on the counter. He heaped a massive pile of steaming eggs onto each, grabbed 4 pieces of burnt toast, and carried them down the hall. Tripp flinched as Garrett approached, but he didn't retreat. Bathroom is the second door on the left, Garrett said, shoving the warm paper plates into Tripp's chest. Eat this. Wash your faces. Then we figure out how to get you out of my house. Tripp nodded quickly, balancing the plates. He looked down at the food, his stomach letting out an audible, violent rumble. Lily peeked out from behind his denim jacket. Her eyes tracked the steam rising from the eggs. Thank you, Tripp whispered. Don't, Garrett snapped. The word came out harsher than he intended. Don't thank me, just eat. He turned his back on them and walked back to the bar. Dutch was leaning against the polished wood, stirring his coffee with the tip of a pocket knife. The shipment from Montreal hits the docks at noon, Dutch murmured, keeping his voice low enough that Jax couldn't hear. We have 2 box trucks rolling out at 1. I need every patched member focused. I cannot have an amber alert sitting in our prospect room when the ATF is already logging our license plates across the street. They're not an amber alert. Wade isn't going to the cops, Garrett said, pouring himself a fresh cup of tar-black coffee. Wade doesn't have to, Dutch countered, folding his knife with a sharp click, because his cousin is already here. Garrett froze. He slowly lifted his head, following Dutch's gaze toward the security monitor above the register. Parked at the edge of the lot, its tires resting exactly on the property line, was a white Ford Explorer with a county sheriff's star decaled on the door. The light bar wasn't flashing. It was just sitting there, idling, a subtle but unmistakable threat. He's been there for 10 minutes, Dutch said, taking a sip of his coffee. Just watching the building. He hasn't called for backup. He's waiting for you to come out. Garrett felt the familiar, cold weight of command settle heavily on his shoulders. He set his coffee mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the wood. Keep the kids in the back, Garrett said. Lock the door. Do not let Jax or anyone else near them. And what are you going to do? Dutch asked, his eyes narrowing. I'm going to go talk to a public servant, Garrett said. He grabbed his leather cut off the stool, shrugging the heavy armored vest over his shoulders. The winged skull on the back felt impossibly heavy. The morning air was brutally cold. It smelled of wet gravel, rotting leaves, and the sharp tang of exhaust fumes rolling off the nearby interstate. Garrett stepped out from beneath the awning, his boots crunching loudly as he walked across the lot toward the idling cruiser. He didn't rush. He walked with the slow, rolling gait of a man who owned the ground he was stepping on. As he approached, the driver's side window of the Explorer powered down with a mechanical hum. Deputy Miller was sitting inside, the heater blasting so high Garrett could feel it from 3 feet away. Miller was a soft man in his late 30s, possessing a doughy face, a neatly trimmed mustache, and a uniform collar that looked a half size too tight. "Morning, Garrett," Miller said. He tried for a casual, authoritative tone, but his eyes were darting nervously toward the clubhouse doors. "Miller," Garrett grunted. He stopped 2 feet from the door, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He didn't lean down to look in the window. He forced the deputy to crane his neck up. "You're off your beat. Route 9 is 2 miles east. Just taking a scenic drive," Miller replied, tapping his fingers nervously on the steering wheel. He cleared his throat. "Look, Garrett, I'm going to make this easy. Wade called me at 4 this morning. He was at the ER getting his nose packed with gauze. Said he slipped on the ice." "It's November. There's no ice," Garrett said flatly. "Yeah, well, he also said that his 2 stepkids ran off. Said he thinks they might have tried to hide out in your compound." Miller shifted in his seat, the leather creaking under his weight. "Now, I know you guys don't want any trouble, and I certainly don't want to bring any trouble to your doorstep. Especially today." Miller let the word "today" hang in the air. It was a clumsy, transparent attempt at leverage. Miller knew about the shipment. Of course he did. The club paid him $1,000 a month to conveniently patrol the opposite side of town when the trucks rolled in. "I run a motorcycle club, Miller," Garrett said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Not a daycare. You want to look around? Get a warrant." Miller's face flushed. "Come on, Garrett. Don't play hardball. Wade is a mess. He's screaming about pressing kidnapping charges. If I have to go to a judge and get a warrant, I have to bring the state boys in. You really want state troopers tossing this place right now over Wade's brats?" It was a valid point, and it pissed Garrett off immensely. Garrett took a half step closer to the vehicle. He leaned down, placing his massive, grease-stained hands on the bottom edge of the open window. The sudden proximity made Miller flinch backward, his hand instinctively dropping toward his duty belt. "Let's get something straight, Deputy," Garrett whispered, staring directly into Miller's pale eyes. "Wade doesn't give a shit about those kids. He cares that the boy took his stash money. You care because Wade probably promised you a cut of it." Miller swallowed hard. "That's an accusation you can't back up." "I don't need to back it up in a courtroom," Garrett said softly. "I just need to make a phone call to the mayor. You remember the mayor? The guy who plays golf with our charter president down in the city? The guy who likes his campaign contributions in unmarked envelopes?" Miller went perfectly still. The arrogance melted off his face, replaced by a sudden, stark realization of exactly who he was dealing with. He wasn't talking to a street thug. He was talking to a man who controlled the illicit economy of an entire county. "Wade owes my club $3,000, Garrett lied again, the story calcifying into absolute truth in his mind. "He tried to skip town. The kids came here because they know we don't play games. They're collateral. You can't take kids as collateral, Garrett. That's a federal offense," Miller stammered, his legal training weakly fighting against his corruption. "I didn't take them. They knocked on my door," Garrett said. "And as long as they are sitting on my property, they fall under my protection. You go back to the hospital. You tell your scumbag cousin that his debt is now $5,000. And if he ever comes looking for the boy or the girl, I will personally burn his trailer to the ground with him inside it." Garrett leaned in a fraction of an inch closer. The smell of the deputy's cheap aftershave mixed terribly with the exhaust. "And if you ever park on my property line again and try to leverage my business, Miller, the envelopes of cash stop. And the photographs of you taking them get mailed to the state prosecutor. Are we absolutely clear?" Miller stared at Garrett. The deputy's breathing was shallow and rapid. He looked at Garrett's eyes, searching for a bluff, but he found absolutely nothing but dead, cold certainty. "Clear," Miller whispered. "Good. Now get off my lot," Garrett said. He pushed himself off the doorframe and took a step back. Miller slammed the Explorer into drive. He didn't even roll the window up. He hit the gas, the tires spitting wet gravel, and sped off down the road, the taillights disappearing into the morning mist. Garrett stood in the cold for a long moment. He had bought them time. Not much, but enough. He turned around and walked back toward the heavy steel door. When he stepped back inside, the warmth of the clubhouse hit him like a physical blow. The smell of scrambled eggs and stale beer was comforting. Dutch was standing exactly where he had left him, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He had watched the entire exchange through the security monitor. "You just threatened a cop over a tweak's runaways," Dutch said. It wasn't a question. "I handled the immediate threat," Garrett corrected him, walking behind the bar and taking his cut off. "You delayed it," Dutch snapped. He walked over, leaning heavily on the bar. The wood creaked. "Wade is desperate. Miller is a coward, but a cornered coward does stupid things. What's the play, Rust? Because you can't keep them here, and you sure as hell can't give them back now." Garrett looked down the dark hallway. He could see the faint yellow of Lily's raincoat, draped over the back of the folding chair where Tripp had left it. "I'm getting them out of the county," Garrett said quietly. Dutch stared at him. "How?" "My sister," Garrett said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Dutch's eyes widened slightly. It was the most profound reaction Garrett had seen from the giant man in 5 years. "Sarah? You haven't spoken to Sarah in a decade. She runs that halfway house up in Burlington for battered women and kids," Garrett said, staring blindly at the rows of liquor bottles on the wall. "She's clean. She's legitimate. If I can get them to her, Wade can never touch them. They vanish into the system, but the safe part of the system." "Burlington is 3 hours north," Dutch said, his voice dropping an octave. "And we have 2 trucks rolling out in 4 hours. You can't leave. If you aren't here when the Montreal guys arrive, they'll think we're setting them up." "I know," Garrett said. He finally turned and looked Dutch in the eye. "Which means I need someone I trust to drive them." Dutch stared at Garrett. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with years of shared violence, shared secrets, and an unspoken brotherhood that superseded blood. Dutch looked down the hallway, then back at his president. "I swear to God, Rust," Dutch muttered, shaking his massive, scarred head. "If I get pulled over with 2 stolen kids in my truck, I am telling the feds everything." Garrett allowed a fraction of a grim smile to touch his lips. "Load up your dually, Dutch. We're getting the strays out of here." Exhaust fumes hung thick in the rear loading bay, turning the frigid morning air into a toxic blue haze that stung the back of the throat. Dutch's Ford F350 dually idled by the heavy roll-up door, the massive diesel engine rattling the loose socket wrenches hanging on the pegboards. Garrett stood watching the tailpipe spit black soot against the wet concrete, a steaming cup of coffee warming his numb, grease-stained fingers. He turned and walked back down the corridor. The clubhouse felt entirely different in the daylight. The neon signs were off, exposing the peeling gray paint on the cinderblock walls, and the deep permanent rot settled into the floorboards. Without the shadows to soften it, the compound looked exactly like what it was, a decaying fortress for aging outlaws. He pushed the prospect's bunk room door open. The hinges screamed in protest. Tripp was already standing, wearing his still damp denim jacket, holding his sister's good hand. Lily wore the oversized yellow raincoat again, though Tripp had tried to wipe the mud off the hem with a wet paper towel. It was a futile gesture, leaving a smeared brown stain across the bright plastic, but one that twisted something deep and uncomfortable in Garrett's chest. "Time to go," Garrett grunted, keeping his voice strictly transactional. Tripp hesitated, his worn sneakers glued to the concrete floor. "Where are we going?" "North," Garrett said. He walked into the cramped room, reaching up to grab a thick wool club blanket folded on the top bunk. It smelled heavily of mothballs, stale Marlboros, and damp wool, but it was thick and incredibly warm. He tossed it to Tripp. "Wrap her in that. The heater in the truck takes 20 minutes to kick in." Tripp caught the blanket, clutching it to his chest. His eyes narrowed with a sudden sharp panic. "Who's driving us?" "The guy who wanted to throw you out last night," Garrett replied bluntly. Tripp stepped back, pulling Lily tightly against his leg. The feral, trapped animal look returned to his dark eyes. No. No way. You're giving us back to Wade. He's going to drive us back to the trailer. Garrett sighed. He didn't have the patience for a screaming match, and he definitely didn't have the time. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, dropping heavily to one knee so he was eye level with the 15-year-old. His bad knee ground together with a sickening pop that echoed in the tiny room. Listen to me, kid, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the tight space. If I wanted to give you back to Wade, I would have tossed you out the front door 3 hours ago. Dutch is taking you to a woman in Burlington. Her name is Sarah. She's my sister. She runs a house where men like Wade can't find you. Ever. The local cops don't go there. The state boys watch it, you understand? Tripp stared at him, his narrow chest heaving under the thin denim. He searched Garrett's weathered, scarred face, looking for the lie. He looked at the harsh lines carved around the president's eyes, the gray, wiry hairs in his beard. The permanent, soul-deep exhaustion settled into his posture. Why? Tripp whispered, his voice cracking violently. Why are you helping us? You don't know us. Garrett didn't look at the boy. He looked down at Lily. She was staring at him with those same empty, bottomless eyes, completely unbothered by the tension in the room. Garrett reached out slowly, deliberately, and gently adjusted the stiff plastic collar of her yellow raincoat so it wouldn't rub against the white tape of her fresh bandage. Because a long time ago, somebody should have opened a door for me, Garrett said quietly. He stood up, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain shooting up his right thigh. Wrap her up. Let's move. They walked out to the cavernous loading bay. Dutch was leaning against the tailgate of the massive truck, smoking a cigarette. He looked utterly miserable. When he saw the kids emerge from the hallway, he didn't smile, didn't offer a reassuring nod. He just took a final, heavy drag, flicked the glowing cherry onto the wet concrete, and yanked open the rear door of the crew cab. Get in the back, Dutch rumbled, his voice scraping like coarse sandpaper. Get down on the floorboards. Throw that wool over yourselves. If we pass a state trooper on the turnpike, I don't want to see a single hair on your heads. Are we absolutely clear? Tripp nodded frantically. He scrambled up into the high cab, practically dragging Lily in behind him. They curled into the cramped, dark space behind the driver's seat, pulling the heavy blanket over their heads until they were nothing more than an indiscernible lump of gray wool. Dutch slammed the door shut. The metallic thud resonated over the engine noise. He turned back to Garrett. 3 hours up, 3 hours back, Dutch said, pulling his thick leather riding gloves out of his back pocket and yanking them on. I'm going to miss the Montreal handoff. I'll handle the Canadians, Garrett said. Just drive fast. And Dutch? Dutch paused, his massive hand resting on the driver's side door handle. Don't stop for coffee, Garrett said. Dutch let out a humorless, breathy grunt. If I get pulled over with 2 kidnapped kids in my back seat, I'm telling the feds they're your bastards, Rust. He climbed into the cab, the heavy truck groaning as it shifted under his immense weight. He slammed the door, threw the column shifter into drive, and the Ford lurched forward. Garrett hit the wall button for the roll-up door. The corrugated metal slats screamed as they coiled upward, letting the pale, unforgiving gray morning light flood the oil-stained garage. Dutch didn't hesitate. He gunned the diesel engine, the massive rear tires gripping the wet asphalt, and pulled aggressively out into the alleyway. Garrett stood in the threshold, the bitter wind whipping his hair, and watched the red taillights blur, then disappear entirely around the corner of the brick building. He stayed there until the mechanical roar of the truck was completely swallowed by the ambient, endless hum of the interstate. Silence returned to the clubhouse, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the tense, suffocating stillness of the midnight storm. It was the hollow, echoing emptiness of a house that had just lost something deeply important. Garrett walked over to the control panel and hit the button to lower the garage door. The metal hit the concrete floor with a heavy, definitive clang. He twisted the handle, threw the heavy iron deadbolt across the track, and walked back into the main room. Jax was furiously wiping down the bar with a rag that smelled strongly of ammonia, his frantic, nervous energy a stark contrast to Garrett's heavy, methodical movements. The prospect stopped scrubbing the wood the second Garrett approached, taking a quick, deferential step backward. "Everything good, boss?" Jax asked, his eyes darting toward the empty, dark hallway leading to the bunk rooms. "Pour me a coffee, Jax." "Then go out front and sweep the puddles off the stoop," Garrett ordered, dropping his heavy leather cut onto the stool. "The Canadians will be here in 3 hours. I want this place smelling like bleach and looking like a legitimate business." Jax nodded quickly, pouring a mug of black sludge from the commercial brewer and sliding it carefully across the polished wood. He scurried out the front door, the bell jingling, leaving Garrett entirely alone in the massive room. Garrett sat down on his usual stool. He wrapped his massive calloused hands around the ceramic mug, letting the intense heat seep into his aching finger joints. He stared up at the security monitor. The gravel lot was empty. No sheriff's cruiser. No rusted F-150, just wet rocks and a weeping sky. He knew this wasn't over. Wade was a cockroach, and cockroaches always came back when the lights went out. Eventually, Wade's amphetamine binge would crash. He would sober up, his broken nose would throb, and he would realize his meal ticket and his punching bags were gone for good. He would start asking questions at the local garages. He would push his spineless cousin to start snooping around the compound. Garrett took a slow sip of the scalding coffee. It burned his tongue, a sharp, grounding pain that he welcomed. When Wade came back, Garrett wouldn't use the shotgun. He wouldn't offer threats in the rain. He would take Jax and 2 other patched members, drive out to that dilapidated trailer park in the dead of night, and solve the problem the way the Hells Angels solved all their problems. It would be violent. It would be entirely permanent. It would add another dark, indelible stain to a ledger that was already saturated with blood. Garrett didn't care. For the first time in over a decade, the impending violence didn't feel like a chore, or a cold business transaction, or a necessary evil required to protect a shipment of illegal rifles. It felt like a debt being paid, a brutal cosmic balancing of the scales. He remembered the sound of a belt buckle hitting the linoleum floor of his own childhood kitchen, the sound that preceded the terror. He remembered the smell of cheap whiskey on his father's breath. He remembered striking a match when he was 16 and walking away from a house engulfed in orange flames, leaving his past to burn. He couldn't undo the things he had done since that night. He reached under the bar, his fingers brushing past the cold steel of the Smith & Wesson, pushing past the worn wood of the sawed-off 12-gauge, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He dropped it onto the bar. It landed with a heavy, dusty thud. He opened it to the middle, the yellowed pages filled with chaotic chicken-scratch accounting of illicit debts, interest rates, and brutal collection schedules. He flipped to the page with Wade's name scribbled furiously at the top. Wade. $3,000. Late. Garrett picked up a thick black permanent marker resting next to the cash register. He uncapped it with his teeth, spitting the plastic cap onto the bar. He drew a thick, heavy black line straight through Wade's name, crossing it out completely, the ink bleeding through the cheap paper. He closed the book. Up in Burlington, Sarah would be waking up soon. She would be putting a kettle on the stove in a kitchen that smelled like fresh oatmeal and clean linen, utterly ignorant of the 2 battered, terrified children currently hurtling toward her at 80 miles an hour in a stolen club truck. She would take them in. She always did. She would look at the weeping burn on the little girl's arm. She would see the bruised jaw on the boy, and she would know exactly who had sent them, even if Tripp never spoke Garrett's name. Garrett leaned back against the bar, staring at the massive winged skull painted on the far wall. The harsh overhead fluorescent bulbs buzzed like an angry hornet's nest. He was a criminal. He was a violent man leading violent men. He sold poison, he broke bones, and he knew, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that he was going to hell. But as he sat alone in the cold, cavernous clubhouse, listening to the rain start to drum against the metal roof once again, he felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation settling deep in the center of his chest. It felt suspiciously like peace. If this gritty, raw journey into the shadows of loyalty and survival struck a chord with you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to support storytelling that doesn't flinch away from the dark realities of the world. Share this video with someone who appreciates complex characters and morally gray choices. And if you want to ride alongside us for more pulse-pounding, deeply human tales, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Garrett's boots? Thanks for watching and stay safe out there.